Hello and welcome to another week of What is this weapon? My name is Joe, I'm on the curatorial team here, stepping in for Jonathan this week, and I'm excited to bring you some very quirky Soviet machine guns. These were invented in the 1930s, and although the Soviet Union has a reputation for being somewhat technologically backwards, these were examples of where they're actually ahead of the curve in the area of aircraft armaments. So they're capable of firing 1,800 rounds a minute, and this was obviously far and above a lot of what was on offer from their contemporaries, so Western nations and the like. And these are the ShKAS machine guns. As these were very fast-firing submachine guns, they were quickly installed in a lot of Soviet aircraft. And if you care to name any Soviet aircraft of the 30s and 40s, it's likely that at some point in their lifespan, these ShKAS machine guns are in them. To give you a few examples, the I-16, the ShVAK series of fighters, the IL-2, the PE-3, the PE-8, many different aircraft that this thing was used on. As a result, it became a really source of Soviet pride in a time where there wasn't much to be proud of, but these machine guns were certainly up there. And they created them in these flexible mount versions, they had wing-mounted versions and synchronized versions, and also larger caliber versions, which we'll have a look at in a bit later. So, to go through the timeline of the creation of these machine guns, late 1930, Boris Shpatalny had invented the first prototypes and mocked up the first prototypes of these machine guns. But it's not until early 1932 that a few examples are ordered by the Board of Artillery for evaluation. 7 examples were ordered to be produced. And in June, they're tested in front of a select group of Soviet industry heads, including Glotov, who's the chairman of the Weapons Board. And he's really impressed by this. He says it spits out a singularly powerful hail of bullets, which really makes an impression. A month later, it's approved for more extensive testing by the Soviet military, and the 11th of October 1932, it's approved for use as the 7.62mm M1932 Shpatalny-Komoritsky rapid-fire aviation machine gun, abbreviated in Russian, the ShKAS. It immediately undergoes in 1933 a series of modifications to prolong its lifespan. Obviously, these things fire incredibly quickly, and a lot of the components weren't up for that strain over a long period of time. The lifespan of some of these are only about 2,000 rounds out of the factory, so they needed to improve it quite quickly. So while production was still in the low hundreds, they introduced an improved version, which simplified some of the components, and also introduced a novel idea in the recoil spring, which is a braided wire spring, which would be very common in things like AKs and MG42s now, but it's first seen in one of these to give the recoil spring a more extended lifespan. By 1935, we're starting to enter production into the thousands, and 1936, the ShKAS sees its first use in combat, not with the Russians, with the Spanish Republican forces in Soviet-donated I-16 fighters. And this is really the heyday of the ShKAS, 1936, where its lightweight and rapid fire capabilities really give it a good reputation in the Spanish Republican forces, and their air combat kill-to-loss ratios are quite good, due in part to the ShKAS. Obviously, there's lots of other factors at play there, but the ShKAS really kind of comes into its own there. There's a few more improvements to the ammunition and things through its lifespan over the next couple of years, and 1940 is really where we hit the full swing of production. 35,000 are being made each year by the 1940. So that's its use into service there. So that's an introduction to the service of the ShKAS machine gun. We'll have a look a bit more about the inner workings of this and how it achieves, its technological improvements over some of its contemporaries. So I'm just about to take this one apart. We can have a look at some of the bits in more detail. Okay, and here we have one of the ShKAS machine guns, which we'll go into the disassembly of in a bit of detail here. So one thing we're going to look at in detail is the feed system, and this has quite a unique for the time rotary feed system. We'll get into that in a little bit. So first things first, to disassemble this, we need to actually lower this follower release lever. Just push it in and rotate it down to 90 degrees away from the receiver. It's got quite a stiff spring in it. So this is the follower release lever. At the bottom of this feed system is the follower that kicks the round up and into the path of the bolt as it comes forward. To get that out the way requires a stiff spring, so we'll put that down to the bottom. And the next step is to pull the charging handle all the way to the rear, like so. As this is a flexi-mount version, this has a large wooden handle. If this was a wing-mounted or synchronized version, it'd just be a cord that pulled out here. But I'll pull that to the rear. That allows me to pull this plate out and unscrew that. As we take this plate off, you know, it's the flat bottom there. It interfaces with the flat top of this charging handle, and that allows me to now rotate and remove the charging handle. With that removed, I can now take this assembly here off the back. And this assembly here is quite interesting as it contains two of the 3 springs that help this thing cycle so quickly. So we've got quite a large buffer at the top, that's for the bolt carrier. And we've got another buffer there for the bolt. Massively stiff springs in this. When the bolt hits the rear point of travel and hits these push it back forward with some force, inducing quite a strong counter recoil there, just to get everything going quickly. You can also see, just here, the pivoting part of the trigger mechanism. It's very, very simple trigger mechanism. So, with that assembly off, we can now slide off the trigger mechanism and the pistol grip here. So that's the follower I mentioned earlier. This has, as I say, quite a stiff spring in it, and as the feed mechanism moves around, this bounces off it and will smack the next cartridge into the path of the bolt, as mentioned. The trigger, very simple, has this little outcropping here, tiny little nubbin there, which interfaces with one on the bottom of this assembly here. Simply pivots around that point, and this part here depresses the sear, disengaging it and allowing the working parts forward. What we're now going to do is pull those working parts out of the rear of the gun. So we're going to have to reattach the charging handle. We're going to slide this plate off, which reveals part of the ejector mechanism running along here, which we'll have a look at a bit later. And crucially, we're going to lie this on its right-hand side to disconnect the ejector mechanism from the working parts, rotating a small lever here which disengages the sear, and that should allow me to push the working parts forward and all the way back and out of the machine gun. So removing the charging handle again to have a look at these in a little bit more detail. So this would be the bolt carrier and the bolt in the unlocked position as it's moving backwards and forwards. And this is very reminiscent of a lot of machine guns of the era. Very, very simple. You've got the gas piston at this end, going back to the bolt carrier here, and you've actually got the recoil spring itself in the rear of this bolt carrier here. So the charging handle, this bar here, or pole which comes out of the charging handle, actually acts more like a spigot on the bolt carrier itself. So when you charge it by pushing the charging handle fully forward, it compresses this recoil spring in here, and when the sear is released, that obviously wants to expand and drives the bolt forward. Of course, this fires from an open bolt. Looking at the bolt itself, so fairly standard, but what you do have is, instead of an extractor, you've actually got a claw here which acts as a cartridge stop. So the walls of the receiver keep this closed, so as the round is introduced from the bottom, I've actually got an inert round here which I can demonstrate. As the round comes in from the bottom, that cartridge stop prevents it from moving past where it should be, basically presenting it over the firing pin. The firing pin is itself free floating, and as it reaches the fully the fully forward part of its travel, this part of the bolt carrier here, this little shoulder, smacks into the back of it and fires the round. Okay, so we've looked at the bolt and the bolt carrier. Taking this top cover off is where we find the first part of the feed mechanism that we're going to look at. So this has a rotary feed mechanism that breaks the loading cycle across into 10 separate actions. Now this means you can use very long belts of up to 1,500 rounds and load them without a lot of friction and drag at very high speeds. It's obviously very useful for use in aircraft. So very simply, this angled rib on the top of the gas piston there interfaces with rollers in the bottom of this assembly. So as that moves forward, the angle moves it first to the right, where this little spring-loaded tooth moves past the rear part of the rotary feed there. When it hits the right-hand wall of its housing, this lever here is depressed, extending it, and as the bolt comes forward, that moves across, rotating the feed and basically setting the cycle up again. Once this hits the fully left side, then that part of the bolt presses this roller across and pushes that tooth in again, ready for the whole action to cycle again. To look at the rest of this, we're going to have to take the front off the machine gun. So to do that, we're going to lift this little catch here, and with some force, we're going to have to rotate this locking wheel, like so. And that should allow me to pull the barrel and gas parts off the front of the machine gun. This does disassemble further, but it's quite fiddly, involving getting a lot of pins out, and given the age of this thing, some of those pins do not want to come out. So we're going to leave this as is for now, but the barrel's fairly standard and you can just see the back of the chamber there. So I'm going to pop that down, and we're left with the receiver and the feed mechanism. So this here is a loading handle. So this allows you to load those first 10 rounds manually. So you lift that up, and as you rotate the handle down anti-clockwise, that rotates the feed mechanism here and loads the first rounds of the belt through from the 6 o'clock position, loads them anti-clockwise. So we're going to take that off, and what that also reveals is here the outer part of the ejection port. Now this is forward ejecting this firearm, which is obviously quite handy in a confined space of perhaps an aircraft turret, and you can see the rest of the ejection port there in the front of the receiver. So we're now going to look at what I think is the most interesting part of the feed mechanism. And as mentioned, this feeds anti-clockwise from the bottom, and these two components here are really the secret to how this thing loads so many rounds so quickly, so reliably. So it avoids the feed pulls dragging rounds in one at a time, and it actually, over the course of 10 actions, extracts the rounds backwards from a disintegrating belt and presents them at the breech. So it splits up the work of dragging them out of the belt and getting the belt moving over the course of many actions with quite a high degree of mechanical advantage as well. So it uses a lot of force to perform small actions, which really helps its effectiveness. So to have a closer look at that, I'm just going to remove this screw here. And that will release both this cowl and what was nicknamed the Birdcage from the receiver itself. So these are the two components together, and this is removing the Birdcage. You can probably see from this how it got its name. Very, very distinctive component. And this is the part that picks up each individual round. But I say it works in tandem with a helical groove within this cowling here. So putting them both together and using this inner round as a demonstration. So this is where it be loaded initially into the machine gun. And as it moves round, you can see, hopefully, as I'm rotating the Birdcage, the round is disappearing further back inside the body of the machine gun itself. When this reaches the 6 o'clock position, again, there is a corresponding hole in the receiver where the follower can knock it up into the path of the bolt. So really quite a unique and clever feed system. Now this does introduce its own problems. It will only work with rimmed cartridges, and I'll talk more on that in a little bit when we look at some of its developments. So only used with rimmed cartridges, but it does really allow you to, as I say, load them quickly and efficiently and pull them out the back of a disintegrating belt with minimal fuss. Looking at the receiver itself, so you can see that hole in the bottom where the rounds go into, and this is the part at the top where the bolt would obviously be moving backwards and forwards. You can also see the other part of the ejection port here. So with this rotary feed mechanism, obviously traditional ejection out the sides of the machine gun aren't possible. So nifty little forward ejection system, which we'll have a look at in just a second, because the last bit to take apart is the ejector here. So you can see you've got a component which runs along a bar here, and the bar twists at the very rearward portion. So as this comes to the rear, this is locked to the bolt carrier. As it comes all the way to the rear, it will rotate, and what that is doing is pushing this arm, sweeping it across the face of the bolt and pushing the round up and out of the way. So that's it, comes to the rear and rotates, sweeping across the face of the bolt. What that means for our components here is it sweeps the round up and out of the off the bolt face and onto, you can see a flattened part on the gas piston here and a little shoulder there. The empty casing would be sitting just there. So if you're looking at this thing in X-ray when it was firing, you'll see a round ready to be fired on the bolt face itself, and the empty case, having just been fired, sitting almost adjacent to it as it's travelling forward. When it reaches fully forward, it will fire one round and eject the empty case out the front of the machine gun there. So that's essentially the full field strip of a ShKAS machine gun. It doesn't go down any further than this, although if you take this plate off, it does reveal the sear mechanism, but as part of a regular field strip, that is not removed at all. That's only able to be maintained at armour level, not at the field level. So that's the full field strip. This is now going to magically reassemble itself, and we'll talk a little bit more about how the ShKAS performed and what its service life went on to be. So hopefully that's given you a bit more insight into how the ShKAS works. So it all really relies on this feed mechanism, breaking down the loading over numerous stages to enable that really high rate of fire to really be effective and reliable. Obviously, I've mentioned there were problems with endurance, especially initially, of some of the parts, and that never really went away throughout its service life. So there are a few elements of production that were typically Soviet. First of all, a lot of components that you would expect to find heat treated in many contemporary firearms were not. And while that did speed up production, it does mean that it's general lower level of skill across the board in terms of maintenance and manufacture. It does mean that a lot of these parts were prone to deforming and warping. Again, sometimes a blessing in disguise. It meant that you'd get smaller malfunctions and stoppages due to the deformation of parts rather than catastrophic breaking of parts. So mixed elements of reliability over a service life there. What also helped improve its reliability over its service life is the ammunition. Although this is chambered in 7.62 by 54 Russian, the same thing used across almost all its infantry weapons, especially the Mosin, regular ammunition could not be used in the ShVAK. The forces of actually loading, firing and extracting was still too extreme for the regular ammunition to reliably function in this. There are reports of it tearing off rims and other such problems. Now, generally, obviously, aircraft ammunition was being produced separately anyway to tighter tolerances, but that was especially important with the ShVAK. They were making special marked 7.62mm ammunition, which had thicker primer cups, case walls, rims, and even double crimped bullets to really make sure this thing stayed together throughout the firing process. These were specially marked and subject to really stringent quality controls. Now, I've seen a few sources say that if it didn't pass quality control for use in aircraft, then they would give these specialist rounds, even armour-piercing incendiary, the tracer rounds, and even explosive rounds to the infantry, even to snipers. But I've not seen any primary sources that back that up, so I'm taking that with a pinch of salt. But I'd certainly be wary if I was any Wehrmacht facing ammunition of that type, certainly. There are other issues with the ammunition they had to solve, even down to the varnish they used with the primers. So they noticed that these started malfunctioning after a few years in service, and it wasn't due to any of the components, it was something to do with the ammunition, a lot of misfires. And it turns out that even domestic Soviet varnish was destroying the foil on the primers and causing them to fail. So it's very rare to see Soviet primers. We actually do have a round of ammunition in the collection, which hopefully we can put some pictures up for you now. And that will show you the most usual form of ShVAK round that you're going to see, including the lacquer on the primer, which indicates this one's just fine. They removed all the others from service, so they're very, very hard to find. But overall, after they'd solved those issues, this thing was, say, well liked, had a great reputation wherever it was used, and it was used often. The problem being, as we now know with development of aircraft armament during the Second World War, rifle caliber machine guns were phased out in terms of heavier caliber stuff as the war went on, as planes became more armoured and generally, more sturdy all round. These were not cutting the mustard anymore, essentially. The future lay in, heavier machine guns. There were some experiments to try and prolong its lifespan, including coupling two of these together, where the rearward travel of one bolt would induce counter recoil on the other, really bumping up the rate of fire, more than double the effective rate of fire of a single machine gun by itself. But it wasn't to be, and these were pretty soon phased out for 12.7mm or 50 cal machine guns. The only saving grace for this is there was a 12.7mm version of the ShKAS in production called the ShVAK. A man called Vladimirov got on board with it and added his name to it, hence ShVAK, not ShKAS, which we can have a quick look at now. So indeed, the future lay with heavier caliber weapons, and luck would have it that the 12.7mm version of the ShKAS, the ShVAK, was in development basically concurrently. Now, Vladimirov, that designer, made a few streamlining choices to these, namely putting the gas piston underneath the barrel rather than over it, giving it a bit more of a sleeker profile. Some other differences as well. You can see obviously there's a longer ejection tube here. As this is a wing-mounted version, you'll notice there's no pistol grip, or the charging handle has just been replaced with this wire and toggle. A few concessions there for that different mounting. The 12.7mm itself did encounter a few difficulties, mainly with its competition. It was competing with a Berezin design that crucially could share ammunition with the Dushka in use with ground forces. Whereas, as you probably worked out with the rotary feed system and that helical cam, this needs to have a rimmed cartridge, and introducing another 12.7mm cartridge with a rim only used in one form of machine gun wasn't really an attractive prospect for a lot of the higher-ups in charge. Obviously, basically logistical nightmares doomed the 12.7mm ShVAK. However, a bonus of Soviet industrial design, they'd actually made the 12.7mm rugged enough to withstand the pressures of firing 20mm rounds. And they realised that with the tolerances they'd already built it with, they would only have to replace the barrel to allow it to fire a proprietary 20mm cartridge. There was still a gap for a 20mm cannon, and the ShVAK stepped into that quite nicely with that larger 20mm barrel. It did make the rounds look a little different. So this is actually a round from an early Gatling, but this was the inspiration for the ShKAS cannon rounds. Almost a straight-walled cartridge with a rim that could be loaded in the rotary feed system that we see here. And this ShVAK cannon was used in, again, I-16s, P-8s, all sorts of different Soviet aircraft for the duration of the war. But it was being slowly phased out towards the later war by, again, another Berezin design, which came in at half the weight and with a more powerful 20mm round, which doomed these to history, I'm afraid. So, to summarise the ShKAS and ShVAK family, they were very successful for their day, earned a great reputation. Their rapid rate of fire and smooth loading, cutting down on reloads, all that kind of good stuff was a real boon in the kind of brush fire wars that were going on pre-Second World War. So I've mentioned Republican Spain were a big fan of these. These were also a big hit in aircraft, in Soviet aircraft in use in China. And even up to the early days of Barbarossa, the ShKAS and ShVAK family were still very, very potent weapons in aircraft. But they couldn't keep up with the pace of development, and they were phased out for more conventional weaponry that could keep pace with the times a bit more. So it's a shame to lose this really fascinating mechanism, and I hope that having a look at this today has given you a bit more insight into this unusual family of Russian guns. So thanks for joining us this week. Thank you for bearing with me for my first time on camera as well. It's been a pleasure to host this episode. As ever, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. It all helps us out. What will also help us out, if you could donate, there should be a link for you down below. Please check out our website, see if you can see any events that you might like to come to, both at our Leeds site, down at Fort Nelson, and of course the Tower of London. So please join us again the same time next week for another What Is This Weapon with a more familiar face. See you next time.